The stories in my book, Violins of Hope, are all inspirational in their own ways, but one of the most dramatic stories is that of a young boy named Motele Schlein. Now, Motele was 12 years old when he was returning to his family home in the small Ukrainian town of Krasnova when the Nazis came, and he was able to hide, but from his hiding place, he heard the gunshots that killed his mother, his father, and his little sister. Motele escaped into the forest, taking with him his precious violin. And he ultimately met up with and joined the legendary partisan brigade known as Uncle Misha's Jewish group. And Motele quickly established himself as a very clever and daring young man with a real knack for espionage. In August of 1943, Uncle Misha was planning to infiltrate the town of Overk, Ukraine. And he dispatched a group of his partisans to spy on the town before they were going to make their entrance. And along with these partisans, he sent along Motele. Motele's job was to pose as a street performer, joining the group of beggars who always stood in front of the church, performing for alms. But secretly, Motele's job was to be keeping an eye out for his fellow partisans, and if they ran into trouble, he could pack up his violin and return to the partisan camp immediately to inform Uncle Misha of the trouble. Motele did as he was instructed. He went to the town, he bought a little bowl from the local market, he sat down, he put that bowl between his legs, took out his violin, and started playing. But Motele was no ordinary street performer. By all accounts, a remarkably talented young boy. And he quickly attracted a large crowd. Suddenly, there was a commotion at the back of the crowd. A Nazi officer worked his way through the crowd and eventually was standing in front of Motele. Motele, his eyes were closed. He was so engrossed in the music that he didn't even notice the Nazi officer until the officer tapped him on the shoulder with his riding crop. Motele glanced up, saw the uniform, and immediately stood up at attention and gave a reverential bow. "Come with me," the officer commanded him. Motele had no idea why he was being summoned. But he had little choice but to go along with it. To do otherwise would be to break his cover and perhaps break the covers of his fellow spies in the town and put their lives in jeopardy. So he followed the officer down a few blocks until they came to a restaurant, a soldiers' club, one of many places that the Nazis had commandeered on their way from Germany to the Eastern Front, as a place where the officers could fortify their spirits when they stayed overnight, with gourmet food, French wine, great music, and pretty Ukrainian waitresses who served them in more ways than one. The officer, assuming that Motele was not the young Jewish boy, but an ethnic Ukrainian, offered Motele a job, performing at the Soldiers Club every day for lunch and dinner. Again, to protect his cover and that of his fellow partisans, Motele had no choice but to accept the position for a few Reichmarks a day and free lunch and dinner. And so every day, Motele would go and play at the Soldiers Club, and he became a real fixture there. They loved this very, very talented young violinist. He became one of their closest friends. The local commandant went so far as to have a German uniform and cap tailored for the young boy. So here's this 12-year-old boy who, again, was just footsteps from his family home when the Nazis murdered his parents and his little sister. And every day, he puts on his German uniform and cap, and he goes to that soldiers' club, and he entertains the officers there. He takes their requests. He plays for them. He befriends them. But the entire time, he's secretly eavesdropping on their conversations, and he's taking note of the types of uniforms and the numbers of officers being dispatched to the Eastern Front. And he's reporting everything back to the partisans, who are, of course, in contact with the Red Army. Motele is a valuable intelligence asset in the war against Nazi Germany. One day, after going down to the basement kitchen for his lunch, Motele noticed down a dimly lit corridor from the kitchen was a door that had been left slightly ajar. Being a curious 12-year-old boy, he walked down that hallway and peered in to see what was behind that door. And what he found was an abandoned storeroom. Empty wine cases, empty herring barrels, just trash that had been forgotten. But along the wall, opposite of that door, he saw a jagged crack along the wall. And instantly, Motele hatched a plot to fill that crack with explosives, blow up the building, and kill all the Germans inside. So every night for about a week or so, Motele would go downstairs, have his dinner in that basement kitchen after his shift, and after finishing his dinner, he'd go back down to that storeroom. He'd take his violin out of the case and hide the violin in an empty barrel and take away an empty violin case. When he brought that violin case back to the Soldiers Club the next morning, it would have a few pounds of explosives hidden inside. He'd sneak back into that storeroom, swap out the explosives for the violin, and then go about his day, seemingly happy to be playing for the Germans. When he'd brought about 40 pounds of explosives into the storeroom, he would sneak back in there to tear away the cracks at the wall to make that crack bigger, so he could pack even more explosives into the wall. In the mornings, he would go down to the river that borders over it, pretending to be swimming or fishing, while secretly looking for a spot along the river that would be just shallow enough for him to make his escape out of town. And on his way back into town, he'd take note of the buildings and the streets he'd have to go by as he made his dramatic escape. The only aspect of the plan that remained unresolved was when. When to blow up the building and kill all the Germans inside. The perfect opportunity finally presented itself one day when a large group of high-ranking SS officers came through Overk on their way to the Eastern Front. They had hoped to take the railway, but the partisans had been so successful in disrupting that they had no choice but to come by car, which meant coming straight through Overk and in to Motele's plot. It was a big day at the Soldiers Club. It filled up quickly with high-ranking VIPs. It was so busy that Motele was forbidden from taking any breaks. He played for hours and hours and hours on end. By the late hours of the night, his fingers ached from having played for so long nonstop. His eyes watered from the cigar smoke that was filling up the room, yet he continued to play. Finally, he was allowed to take his leave. He went downstairs to the basement kitchen and told the cook that he was simply too tired from having played for so long to eat dinner, and he was just going to go home and go to sleep. But instead, he crept back down that dark hallway. He felt around until he reached the door and quietly closed that door behind him. Using just a few rays of light from a grated window as his guide, he ignited the fuse and then ran out up the stairs and out the hallway, pausing only to throw out his right arm and extend a sarcastic Heil Hitler to the soldier who was standing guard at the Soldiers Club. The soldier, familiar with the affable young Ukrainian boy in his German uniform, simply laughed, "Ah, you little Ukrainian swine," and Motele vanished into the darkness. He ran for several yards until he felt the ground shake beneath him. He heard the window pane shattering behind him. He looked up over his shoulder and saw a red ball extending into the sky. But he didn't have time to celebrate. He had to make his escape. He pressed his body up against buildings to avoid being seen as he followed the route he'd so carefully planned, and then plunged himself into the river, holding the violin in its case above his head to protect it from the cold water that reached all the way up to his neck. When he reached the other side, a group of Uncle Misha's partisans were there to pluck him out of the water, throw him in the back of a carriage, and disappear back into the safety of the forest. For a few moments, Motele was speechless, stunned by the overwhelming success of his mission. And then, raising a clenched fist to the red sky, he declared, "That is for my parents and my little sister."